a boundless desert. The oppressive heat melts the horizon. 3 elite Mongol trackers are relentlessly pursuing a lone horseman. His detachment has been shattered, his supply trains captured, and his family languishes in captivity. The fugitive has nothing left but a broken bow and exactly 3 arrows. One of them is completely blunt, entirely stripped of its iron arrowhead. Anyone else in his position would have surrendered or meekly accepted their impending death. But this warrior violently wields his horse around. His fingers naturally find the bowstring, sending that very same blunt projectile flying straight towards its target. A shot rings out. The wooden shaft pierces the tracker's eye with the absolute precision of a jeweler. To the 2 surviving Mongols, the lone rider throws a chilling, ice-cold warning. There are still 2 combat arrows left in this quiver. They will cost you your lives. Get out. And the invincible nokers of Genghis Khan, men who were accustomed to slaughtering cities of millions, lower their blades in a wave of superstitious dread and retreat. Who is this man, the unknowable one, who managed to make the ferocious dogs of war tremble in fear? The year is 1220. The greatest Islamic state of its time, the Khwarazmian Empire, is choking on its own blood. Previously, we witnessed how the sheer cowardice of Sultan Muhammad II threw his entire country to the wolves, and how the political ambitions of the Snake Queen, Turkan Khatun, paralyzed the national army. Sprawling megalopolises are falling to their knees. Regional rulers are frantically hiding their gold in secret mountain caches, and the world has frozen in one singular conviction: the Mongol death machine simply cannot be stopped. But while these crowned cowards were busy surrendering their capital cities, a completely different story was being written in the northeast, in the provincial city of Khujand. On a tiny, rocky island situated right in the middle of the roaring Syr Darya River, a solitary commandant dug in and outright refused to bend the knee. Instead of trying to patch up fragile clay walls that were doomed to fall under the relentless bombardment of Chinese catapults, he turned his gaze toward the water. Today, you will witness a technological marvel that was literally centuries ahead of its time. You will learn exactly how the towering intellect of a single engineer managed to crush multi-thousand-strong tumens of hardened nomads. You will discover the closely guarded secret of the very first ironclads in medieval history, floating fortresses that were completely invulnerable to both fire and Mongol steel. We will trace the path of the most desperate river chase of the 13th century, where the water itself boiled with a hail of arrows, and a daring breakout through an agonizing trap of fire became the stuff of absolute legend. Why did Genghis Khan, a man who knew absolutely no mercy, harbor such a genuine, profound admiration for this audacious enemy? How exactly did a mere handful of defenders manage to turn a banal, everyday siege into a living psychological nightmare for the invaders? It is widely believed that the fates of entire civilizations are decided by colossal armies and all-powerful lords sitting on golden thrones. However, the events that are about to unfold definitively prove otherwise. In the moment of absolute catastrophic collapse, when laws crumble into dust and the elite completely betray their people, the dignity of a nation can be defended by just one man. He did not save the Khwarezmian Empire, but he absolutely saved its honor. We begin our chronicle of unparalleled courage and cold, calculated logic. This is Chronicles of the Greats, the Wrath of God series, Episode 4, Timur Melik, the Iron Commandant on the Syr Darya. Spring of the year 1220. The great Khwarezmian Empire is crumbling into dust, disintegrating like sun-baked clay beneath the thundering hooves of heavy cavalry. Otrar has been reduced to smoldering ruins. Bukhara has bowed before the victor. Samarkand is choking on its own blood. Genghis Khan's army does not operate like a chaotic, elemental horde, but rather as a flawless mechanism of annihilation, one that has entirely absorbed the engineering genius of conquered northern China. Following right behind the swarms of horse archers, massive supply trains rumble forward, carrying ballistas and stone-throwing trebuchets capable of shattering absolutely any stronghold. At this precise moment, in the northeast of this collapsing superpower, right at the walls of Khujand, a profound drama is unfolding, one that shatters all the established laws of military science of that era. The vanguard tumens of the nomads are steadily approaching this ancient hub of the Great Silk Road. Emir Timur Melik peers intently into the horizon, which is entirely obscured by the dust kicked up by these countless hordes. He has a grand total of exactly 1,000 warriors at his disposal. This tiny handful of men feels like a drop in the ocean compared to the overwhelming avalanche of hardened veterans whose numbers are counted in the tens of thousands. Traditional military tactics dictate that he should lock the city gates, pray to the heavens, and simply wait for inevitable death beneath a relentless hail of Chinese stone projectiles. But Timur Melik flat out refuses to play by the invaders' rules. Having assessed the fatal weakness of his own fortifications with the cold, calculating rationality of a master engineer, he makes a sweeping decision that stuns both his own men and the approaching enemy. The commandant issues an order to abandon the city. Instead of fruitlessly defending doomed bastions, he completely evacuates his tiny garrison and all their vital supplies to a small rocky island situated right in the middle of the roaring channel of the Syr Darya. Khujand is handed over to the enemy without a single drop of blood being spilled. Timur Melik takes a desolate chunk of wild rock washed by rapid, churning currents, and transforms it into a brand new, totally impregnable citadel. Concealed within this highly unconventional maneuver was an act of genuine, unadulterated strategic genius. The Khwarezmian commander understood the primary, fatal weakness of his opponent. Nomads are the absolute masters of the land. Their overwhelming power rests entirely on rapid maneuverability, dense cavalry formations, and literal clouds of arrows. However, water completely nullified every single one of these trump cards. Steppe warriors, born and raised on the vast, dry plains, harbored a deep, superstitious fear of deep rivers. By trading solid earth for the ever-shifting, chaotic element of the Syr Darya, Timur Melik expertly knocked the invaders' greatest weapon right out of their hands, their mobility. The Mongol generals, having occupied the empty city blocks and spotting these stubborn holdouts on the island, only sneered in contempt. They firmly believed that the Khwarezmian had made a fatal, amateur mistake by backing himself into a totally inescapable trap. The steppe warlords fully expected to effortlessly shoot this tiny rocky patch to pieces right from the safety of the riverbank, turning it into a mass grave densely bristling with their arrows. But harsh reality dealt them a severe lesson. Timur Melik's mathematical calculations turned out to be surgically precise. The island was situated at such an exact distance from both riverbanks that the heavy Mongol arrows completely lost their lethal kinetic energy in mid-flight and either plopped helplessly into the rushing water or harmlessly scratched the thick shields of the defenders. An utterly absurd situation unfolded. the supposedly invincible war machine, which had effortlessly shattered grand kingdoms and ground gigantic megalopolises into fine dust, suddenly found itself completely and utterly paralyzed. Untold thousands of forces milled helplessly on the riverbanks, hurling angry curses at a mere 1,000 brave souls who were openly mocking them from an unreachable rock. The commandant's triumph seemed absolute. However, he drastically underestimated the methodical, almost inhuman persistence of Genghis Khan's empire. The nomads did not know how to swim, but they were absolute masters of another dark art, forcing conquered peoples to perform the unthinkable. If a Mongol horse is physically incapable of crossing a river, then the conquerors will simply command that river to disappear. The very trap that the emir had considered his ultimate salvation began to slowly, inexorably snap shut. Genghis Khan's generals, men entirely accustomed to grinding multi-million population megalopolises into dust in a matter of weeks, stood frozen in impotent fury before a narrow strip of churning water. The defiant commandant of Khujand had transformed the river into an insurmountable shield, leaving the finest cavalry in all of Eurasia impotently pacing on the muddy bank. However, the nomads possessed a universal resource that more than compensated for their total lack of a naval fleet. That resource was human flesh. The Mongol commanders issue an order that is deeply shocking in its methodical, industrial-scale cruelty. They deploy their favorite, most horrific tactic, the hashar, the systematic use of prisoners of war as a living labor force and human shield. The invaders round up tens of thousands of miserable captives from Otrar, a city that had only recently drowned in its own blood, as well as from neighboring ruined villages. They begin the execution of an engineering project truly comparable in its sheer scale to the construction of the ancient pyramids. Only these structures are being raised under the relentless crack of whips. The warlords decide to physically annihilate the water barrier altogether. They intend to fill the Syr Darya with rocks, forcibly connecting the riverbank to the unreachable island. From a bird's-eye view, this grim panorama resembled a giant anthill infected with a virus of self-destruction. 50,000 emaciated humans, a population equivalent to the largest European capitals of that time, were lined up in endless living chains. Slaves dragged massive boulders from the spurs of the nearby mountains on their bleeding, broken backs. Descending to the roaring, raging current, they hurled the heavy rock down into the water. Those who collapsed from sheer exhaustion or lost consciousness were mercilessly shoved right in after the stones by their cruel overseers. Human bodies became the exact same foundational building material for this man-made causeway as the dead rock itself. The artificial isthmus crept inexorably forward, slicing through the riverbed centimeter by grueling centimeter. Standing on that tiny rocky patch, deafened by the roar of the water and the agonizing screams of his dying countrymen, was Timur Melik. Clad in heavy, scaled combat armor, the commandant watched the encroaching wave of death without ever looking away. His officers, gripping their saber hilts until their knuckles turned stark white, vehemently demanded an immediate sortie. The psychological pressure was utterly unbearable. Watching your own people, driven by whips, literally build the road to your own execution block is a twisted psychological torture designed to break the will of even the most resilient fighters. The soldiers were practically begging for a suicidal charge, desperate to disrupt the dam's construction before it finally touched their sanctuary. But Timur Melik simply raised his hand, instantly extinguishing this fiery impulse with a totally ice-cold command. Why did he delay? Why did this brilliant tactician, watching the enemy lay a path straight to his throat, calmly order his men to remain hidden in their shelters. Sultan Muhammad II, commanding a colossal army of 400,000 sabers, had completely surrendered to primal, animalistic fear and cowardly fled from mere enemy patrols. But Timur Melik, with only 1,000 doomed warriors at his back, reasoned with the terrifying, crystal-clear logic of a chess grandmaster. He recognized the absolute tragic futility of a head-on collision. To hurl his garrison at the rising dam would simply mean exposing his soldiers to a solid, unbroken downpour of arrows from the dense ranks of Mongol archers lined up on the shore. The mighty steppe war machine would have chewed the Khwarezmians to pieces in a matter of minutes without losing a single horseman. The commandant needed something vastly greater than blind, foolish valor. He was searching for a technological miracle. The steppe generals, reveling in their own cunning, genuinely believed they were solving a trivial logistical puzzle. They had no doubt whatsoever the exact second that stone embankment touched the rock, their heavily armored cavalry would furiously storm the island and trample those arrogant fools into the bloody mud. The nomads believed that they had subjugated nature itself, forcing the mighty river into a hasty retreat. In reality, however, they were meticulously building the absolute perfect trap for themselves with their own bare hands. By forcing their troops onto a narrow, highly restricted isthmus, one that was totally exposed to fire from all sides and devoid of the slightest room to maneuver, the Mongols were freely handing them their one and only true advantage, their mobility. A brilliant, staggering historical irony emerges here. The greatest siege operation ever conducted on the Syr Darya, expressly designed to serve as the Khwarezmian commander's tomb, was rapidly transforming into the ultimate testing ground for his genius weapon. Timur Melik wasn't just passively watching the dam being built. He was buying invaluable, precious time. While the captives hurled heavy boulders into the water, axes were continuously, rhythmically chopping away on the side of the island, entirely hidden from enemy eyes. The defenders of Khujand were operating in the strictest secrecy, engineering something that no warlord of the Great Steppe had ever encountered before. It was a brilliant design, capable of completely neutralizing the enemy's crushing numerical superiority and turning Genghis Khan's invincible army into a totally helpless target. The stone spit had almost touched the rocky shore. The invaders were already drawing their blades and pulling back their bowstrings, eagerly preparing for the final bloody assault. But they had forgotten one immutable fundamental truth. Water is a highly volatile element that absolutely does not recognize the decrees of any Khagan, and the man who can successfully clad this element in heavy armor will walk away from this doomed battle as the ultimate victor. The Mongol commanders were actively celebrating. The grand stone dam, erected upon the broken backs of thousands of exhausted slaves, had almost reached the very middle of the Syr Darya. The nomads genuinely believed that they had successfully bent nature to her knees. The invaders fully expected to pin this tiny handful of rebels against the wall, permanently stripping them of any space to maneuver. The seasoned steppe veterans were already salivating at the thought of their heavy cavalry thundering across the man-made spit and slaughtering the defenders in a matter of minutes. In stark reality, however, Timur Melik had intentionally allowed them to get this close for one singular, calculated purpose: to draw the dam into the absolute perfect striking distance. The sheer irony of the situation simply staggers the imagination. The monumental, back-breaking efforts of 50,000 men poured into the construction of this stone isthmus did not bring the Mongols a single step closer to victory. The enemy had merely created a massive, entirely stationary target for the Khwarezmians. Venturing out onto the water in a standard wooden boat promised absolute, certain death. Just one precise hit from a Chinese incendiary projectile launched from the shore, and the vessel would instantly turn into a raging, floating torch. Fully grasping this immense risk, the commandant of Khujand executes an intellectual breakthrough that catapulted military technology several centuries ahead of its time. He builds a fleet. 12 unique vessels, the likes of which the entire continent of Asia had never laid eyes upon. The true secret of these engineering marvels lies strictly in the details. Timur Melik's master craftsmen densely wrapped the wooden sides of the boats in a thick, heavy layer of soaking wet felt. Over top of this material, they drape tough, dense ox hides that have been generously, heavily soaked in vinegar. Why vinegar? The commandant's engineering genius told him exactly what to do. An aggressively harsh, acidic environment is unparalleled at neutralizing the combustion of deadly petroleum-based fire mixtures. Narrow, precise embrasures are meticulously carved into the solid sides for shooting. What we are looking at are the very first true ironclads in medieval history. A thick, impenetrable blanket of night descends. 12 dark silhouettes silently cast off from the island's rocky shore. They glide smoothly along the violently churning currents and draw right up to the newly constructed dam. Mongol sentries immediately raise the alarm. Hundreds of bright torches instantly flare to life. The night sky is violently illuminated by a massive swarm of incendiary arrows and flying clay pots filled to the brim with boiling oil. A terrifying, deadly hail crashes down upon the small flotilla. But the utterly incredible happens. The roaring fire just helplessly hisses and dies out the exact second it strikes the chemically protected armor. Heavy steel arrowheads simply get bogged down deep within the multi-layered covering, causing absolutely zero harm to the crews inside. These floating pillboxes prove to be completely, totally invulnerable. Through the narrow slits, the Khwarezmians unleash a devastating point-blank barrage. Heavy crossbow bolts mercilessly punch right through the densely packed rows of laborers and guards stationed on the dam. An uncontrollable, screaming panic erupts. The terrified slaves drop their boulders, while the Mongol overseers shriek as they plummet into the rushing water. The massive artificial spit, which had cost the invaders a colossal amount of grueling labor, begins to rapidly, spectacularly collapse under the brilliantly synchronized strikes of the raging river and the island's defenders. The towering intellect of just one single man had effortlessly ground the most destructive military machine on the face of the planet to an absolute halt. Night after night, the 12 clay-colored monsters go out on the hunt, effortlessly grinding the daytime labor of tens of thousands of slaves into fine dust. Genghis Khan's generals furiously bite their lips until they bleed, forced to painfully acknowledge their own utter technological helplessness on the water. Timur Melik's triumph appears to be absolute. He has graphically proven the impossible to the world. The invincible horde can indeed be made to bleed and forced to retreat. However, every single success achieved under the brutal conditions of a siege conceals a deeply ruthless dark side. The commander's sheer genius is more than capable of deflecting 1,000 flying arrows, but it is utterly incapable of feeding his starving soldiers. On that tiny rocky patch, provisions are rapidly, terrifyingly running out. Every single handful of millet is now valued at far more than its weight in pure gold. The besieged men understand with absolute, horrifying clarity. If they linger on this rock any longer, it won't be enemy steel that kills them, but a slow, deeply agonizing death by starvation. The trap has definitively, finally snapped shut. time has officially crossed over to the side of the invaders. To sit idly in place simply means to slowly turn into the walking dead. Capitulation, on the other hand, promises eternal disgrace and certain slaughter beneath the sharp knives of the executioners. The commandant is left with absolutely no safe, viable options. He needs a solution that is truly grandiose in its sheer, unadulterated madness. And so, Timur Melik proudly chooses a third path. He issues the command for his people to board the boats. The only path to freedom lies straight through an absolute hell of fire. An ominous, deeply unsettling silence descends upon the tiny rocky island. The garrison's provisions are rapidly evaporating, transforming every new dawn into a highly sophisticated form of torture. A deeply bitter historical irony begins to emerge. Timur Melik had engineered a completely invulnerable citadel to wait out the relentless attacks of the nomads. But in reality, the brilliant engineer had personally constructed the absolute perfect prison for his own garrison. The fortress, which had so reliably shielded his people from Chinese ballistas and Mongol sabers, now inevitably condemned them to a painfully slow death by starvation. The commandant makes a decision that is simply staggering in its sheer audacity. He categorically, stubbornly refuses to surrender to the enemy's highly questionable mercy. The surviving warriors, their families, and their deeply meager belongings are hastily, frantically loaded onto the 12 specially prepared vessels. Under the heavy cover of pitch-black night, this small but highly formidable squadron, carefully encased in dense, soaking wet felt and shielded by vinegar-soaked hides, silently casts off from their sanctuary rock. The fugitives aggressively plunge headfirst down the wildly churning currents of the mighty Syr Darya. And so begins the most massive, breathtakingly desperate river chase of the entire 13th century. Mongol sentries instantly detect the movement in the dark. Dozens of bright signal fires erupt violently along the banks, quickly transmitting the alarm for many kilometers downriver. Thousands of hardened veterans leap desperately into their saddles. The heavy cavalry gallops parallel to the fleeing flotilla along both sides of the river, kicking up massive, choking clouds of thick dust. The sky itself turns pitch black from the sheer volume of flying arrows. Heavy steel arrowheads viciously drum against the clay-like armor, sinking with a dull thud deep into the damp felt, but absolutely failing to pierce the protection. Safely concealed within the holds, the Khwarezmians fiercely snap back, unleashing a furious storm of fire through their narrow gun ports. Crossbow bolts mercilessly shred through the dense ranks of the nomads, easily piercing right through their tough leather armor and hurling horsemen off steep cliffs straight down into the violently churning waters below. Every single vessel operates as an entirely autonomous, floating fortress, leaving a long, horrific, bloody trail on the rushing surface of the river. The sheer scale of what is unfolding is truly mesmerizing. Just imagine an entire mobilized city hurtling down the water under a non-stop, devastating crossfire. The military commander instantly transforms from a calculated armchair strategist into an ice-cold ship's captain. He stands completely motionless on the deck of his flagship, tirelessly, relentlessly orchestrating deeply complex naval maneuvers. However, the river itself harbors its own deadly hidden traps. The channel twists and turns violently, creating treacherous sandbanks and totally unpredictable, violently swirling whirlpools. Some of the boats, entirely losing steering control, slam brutally into sandy shallows or spectacularly shatter with a sickening crack against hidden underwater rapids. Mongol lassos instantly bite into the wooden wreckage, mercilessly dragging the doomed defenders onto the shore for a swift, brutal execution. Timur Melik watches the horrific deaths of his own people with his very own eyes. The agonizing screams of the wounded carry clearly to his ears, yet the commandant's face maintains an ice-cold, deeply terrifying calm. In this exact moment, the commander completely discards all human emotion, relying entirely on cold, mathematical calculation. Any attempt whatsoever to moor the ships in order to rescue the straggling crews would inevitably, absolutely result in the total destruction of the entire remaining squadron. The ships press forward, abandoning the fallen in their wake. The flotilla successfully smashes its way through hundreds of kilometers of deadly enemy ambushes. The agonizing days blur into an endless, exhausting series of brutal skirmishes. Men sleep in rushed shifts right at their heavy oars, tearing into brutally dry flatbread and quenching their thirst with murky river water beneath the unceasing, terrifying hiss of flying arrows. The Iron Commandant graphically proves the completely unthinkable to all of Asia. The totally invincible horde of the Earthshaker can absolutely be forced to swallow dust, suffer colossal casualties, and furiously pace the riverbanks in utter impotence. But a deeply grim, dark side to this phenomenal tactical triumph begins to slowly emerge. The empire of Genghis Khan possesses far too many gigantic, endless resources to ever forgive such a deeply humiliating insult. The Khwarezmian commander's sheer audacity had successfully bought a few extra days of life for the remnants of his battered garrison, but that exact same audacity had also backed the fugitives into a total, inescapable strategic dead end. Dead ahead, directly in the path of the rapid current, the massive, imposing black silhouettes of the city of Khujand inevitably began to rise, and right where the water had always served as an unobstructed open highway to total freedom, it suddenly, terrifyingly transformed into an impenetrable, deadly wall of doom. The violently rushing current of the Syr Darya, which had safely shielded the fugitives for hundreds of kilometers, suddenly and drastically changes its very nature. The raging flow, which had served as a highly reliable road to freedom, is now inexorably, relentlessly carrying the entire flotilla straight into the maw of the devil. The steppe military machine had fully activated its flawless, lightning-fast communications network. While the cavalry patrols relentlessly chased the boats down the riverbanks, Genghis Khan's couriers, riding relay horses to their absolute deaths, had already delivered a deadly order far down the channel, straight to the massive city of Khujand. The commandant of Khujand had genuinely, truly believed that he had broken out into wide-open operational space, and that the mighty elemental force would safely carry the remnants of his garrison to safe, protected regions. In harsh reality, however, the enemy's brilliant strategists had expertly utilized that borrowed time to transform the mighty river into a completely sealed, inescapable stone bag. The deeply fickle water, which had just granted the Khwarezmians temporary invulnerability, was now viciously herding them straight to the execution block. On the immediate approaches to Khujand, a massive dark line suddenly violently slashes across the horizon. As he draws closer, Timur Melik spots a truly grandiose, terrifying engineering blockade. The nomads have permanently chained dozens of heavy, massive barges together with thick steel chains, totally and permanently blocking the deep navigational channel. Looming on the banks, looking exactly like massive birds of prey, stand hastily assembled Chinese catapults and massive ballistas. The artillery crews are already holding heavy clay pots filled to the brim with boiling volatile oil at the ready. The very surface of the water definitively transforms into an inescapable, deadly trap. Attempting to ram right through this ironclad barrier with wooden, albeit heavily felt-covered hulls seems utterly, mathematically impossible. But to break in the midst of the violently rushing current means instantly transforming into a completely stationary target for a barrage of incendiary projectiles. The air is already screaming as it is torn apart by heavy flying stones and massive, roaring fireballs. The military commander makes a desperate, life-altering decision in a fraction of a second. Since the waterway is completely, physically blocked, only solid land remains. Timur Melik barks out a frantic, desperate order to his helmsman: drive the surviving vessels straight onto the bank. The heavy hulls aggressively plow into the coastal pebbles with a dull, sickening crunch. The Khwarezmian warriors, utterly exhausted from the grueling multi-day chase, leap aggressively from the holds, tightly gripping drawn, razor-sharp sabers in their hands. A totally chaotic, completely insane hand-to-hand slaughter erupts. 1,000 exhausted, soot-covered defenders from the island desperately bite right into the tightly packed ranks of fresh, well-rested enemy tumens. This brutal head-on collision is exactly like throwing a mere handful of sand against a raging hurricane. The invaders possess a colossal, totally overwhelming numerical superiority, but Timur Melik's men fight back with the primal, terrifying fury of doomed men who have absolutely nothing left to lose. Behind this highly suicidal amphibious assault lay cold, brutal calculation. The commander of Khujand knew the horrific fate of his colleague from Otrar, Inalchuk Genghis Khan, whose deep greed the Mongols had violently quenched by pouring molten silver into his eyes and ears far too well. He fully grasped the absolute, mechanical ruthlessness of the Yasa. Any enemy who inflicts damage upon the troops of the Khagan and forces them to bleed is subject to total, immediate annihilation. Surrender guaranteed absolutely nothing but long, highly inventive, agonizing torture. The only remaining exit was to violently hack a bloody corridor straight through a living, breathing wall of flesh, paying a completely unimaginable price in blood for every single step forward. The horrific meat grinder on the blood-soaked shore of Gend violently claims the lives of almost all of his closest comrades. Hot blood mixes thickly with the cold river sand. Enemy lassos mercilessly snatch the weakest, most exhausted fighters right out of the tightly packed defensive lines. Right before Timur Melik's very eyes, the invaders violently capture his precious supply train. Women, young children, his entire beloved family suddenly find themselves firmly in the clawed, brutal grip of the invaders. The agonizing screams of his loved ones violently tear at his very soul, and for one brief, horrific moment, an unbearable agony flashes across the commander's eyes, a desperate, wild urge to hurl himself deep into the very thick of the enemies and die right there beside them. He aggressively throws himself into the densest cluster of foes and, by some absolute miracle, manages to tear his daughter out of the deadly encirclement. With brutal, sweeping strikes of his heavy blade, the military commander aggressively hacks his way straight through the dense cordon, violently tearing free from the rapidly closing ring of death. Out of 1,000 elite, hand-picked heroes, only a pitiful, tiny handful of deeply wounded, gasping shadows manages to stumble out into true freedom. The deeply proud emir, who had only recently commanded a bustling city and a totally unique naval flotilla, has now lost absolutely everything: his homeland, his family, his entire army. He has successfully torn his way out of the trap, but the absolute triumph of his salvation distinctly tasted of bitter ashes. Genghis Khan's seasoned generals had absolutely no intention of ever forgiving the deep insult dealt to their profound pride. The absolute best, most elite trackers of the Great Steppe are immediately unleashed on the fugitives' trail. The former garrison commander has been brutally transformed into a hunted, totally isolated lone wolf, and his heavy quiver, which only yesterday was tightly packed with dozens of deadly, lethal stingers, is now completely, terrifyingly empty. The boundless, heavily sun-scorched expanse of the Kizilkum Desert, the intensely roasting air violently distorts the horizon, transforming the massive sand dunes into shifting, deeply deceptive mirages. Across this totally dead sea of sand, a lone horseman slowly, agonizingly trudges forward. His entirely unique river flotilla has been burnt to the waterline. His combat detachment has been utterly annihilated, and his beloved family has been violently dragged into captivity. The great emir, who only yesterday was aggressively dictating terms to an invincible horde, now stands completely exposed before the world as highly vulnerable hunted prey. 3 highly elite Mongol trackers are relentlessly, methodically following his every step. The seasoned steppe warriors are systematically driving their exhausted victim right into a tight corner. The invaders genuinely believed that they were actively pursuing a deeply broken man, someone whose final reserves of strength had run completely dry. In stark reality, however, they were hunting a core of solid steel that was absolutely impossible to bend. A truly incredible, staggering historical contradiction is born right here. The absolute best military machine in all of Eurasia, one that effortlessly wipes entire massive megalopolises off the face of the earth, found itself completely, totally powerless against the raw stubbornness of one single fugitive. The distance between the advancing riders is shrinking terrifyingly fast. The Khwarazmian's horse wheezes heavily, violently stumbling over the intensely roasting sand. The commander understands with absolute clarity, running any further is totally pointless. He quickly assesses his meager arsenal. His bow has suffered a deep crack. His heavy quiver is almost completely empty. Inside, a mere 3 arrows rattle forlornly, and to make matters worse, one of them is completely blunt, entirely stripped of its lethal iron arrowhead. An ordinary man, in such a terrifying second, would have instantly dropped to his knees, loudly begging for a swift, merciful death. But Timur Melik aggressively pulls back on the heavy reins. He violently turns his deeply exhausted horse entirely around to directly face the rapidly advancing threat. The commandant of Khujand cold-bloodedly pulls that exact same blunt, highly imperfect wooden arrow straight out of his quiver. He expertly notches it onto the string of his deeply damaged bow. His powerful back muscles tense up aggressively. The dry wood protests with a pitiful, loud creak. The enemies charge forward with wild, triumphant whoops toward their easy target, eagerly salivating at the thought of a swift, bloody reprisal. A shot rings out. The blunt wooden shaft aggressively tears right through the roasting air with the absolute precision of a jeweler and violently buries itself deep inside the eye of the lead Mongol. The warrior violently crashes out of his saddle, dead before he even hits the ground. The 2 remaining pursuers violently pull back on their reins, instantly paralyzed by the deeply sudden, highly unexpected death of their comrade. And it is right then that the lone, exhausted fugitive throws a phrase at them in an ice-cold whisper, a phrase that has permanently, forever etched itself into the annals of history. I have exactly 2 combat arrows left. They will cost you your lives. Leave. Genghis Khan's hardened veterans, men totally accustomed to casually marching over mountains of bloody corpses, experience a deep, primal shudder of dread. Clashing directly against such supernatural, utterly terrifying calmness, they silently lower their weapons. The highly seasoned steppe warriors violently wheel their mounts around and ride rapidly away, willingly surrendering life to a man who absolutely, categorically refused to give his up. Such is the incredibly beautiful legend of Timur Melik's miraculous salvation. Having successfully traversed the desolate, waterless wastelands, our hero does far more than just survive. He actively rallies and gathers all the scattered, deeply broken detachments of surviving Khwarezmians around himself. He ultimately arrives at the court of Crown Prince Jalal al-Din, not as some pathetic begging fugitive, but rather as a highly powerful, greatly respected military commander, bringing an impressive 30,000 hardened combat veterans directly with him. In order to firmly seal this highly vital political and military alliance, Jalal al-Din officially marries Timur Melik's daughter. The former commandant of Khujand instantly becomes the absolute most critical, highly respected general of the entire resistance movement. But even this truly grandiose, deeply epic saga inevitably approaches its dramatic finale. In the autumn of the year 1221, directly on the banks of the violently churning Indus River, Jalal al-Din's army finds itself hopelessly pinned against the roaring water by the massive forces of Genghis Khan himself. In this totally monstrous, deeply apocalyptic meat grinder, desperately providing cover for his beloved son-in-law and royal prince, Timur Melik accepts his absolute final battle. The Iron Commander perishes violently deep in the thickest crush of enemies, defending the lost honor of his totally collapsed empire, with a heavy sword tightly gripped in his hands until his absolute last breath. Such is the brutal, highly unforgiving historical truth. But the East flat out categorically refused to accept it. A proud people who had just violently lost their entire homeland totally refused to accept that their fiercely defiant hero, their ultimate shining symbol of resistance, simply vanished forever into the bloody, cold mud of a foreign river. The desperate people drastically needed a powerful myth, one that would vastly outlive the brutal invaders themselves. And so a deeply beautiful, profoundly heart-wrenching legend began to be rapidly passed from mouth to mouth. Decades later, an incredibly old man is slowly wandering through the bustling streets of a completely rebuilt Khujand. The rough, deeply coarse robe of a Sufi dervish entirely conceals his true identity. Absolutely no one recognizes the once fiercely terrifying master of the river in this ragged, begging wanderer. The deeply aged emir could have very easily lived out the rest of his quiet days, permanently hidden under the completely safe guise of a holy madman. However, any kind of compromising deal with his very own conscience entirely contradicts his proud nature. The old man openly and proudly presents himself entirely to the local Mongol governor and proudly, loudly declares his true name. He violently throws his totally unrepentant, fiercely defiant audacity directly into the faces of the new masters of the world, flatly refusing to bend the knee. The absolutely infuriated rulers brutally execute him. But this violent death ultimately decides absolutely nothing anymore. Timur Melik willingly and proudly steps right onto the execution block, establishing the ultimate, absolute victory of the human spirit over deeply soulless, brutal brute force. The grand finale of this profound story leaves us alone with a deeply probing question. What exactly constitutes true defeat? Sultan Muhammad successfully preserved his life, but he completely lost his honor, dying in a state of absolute, pathetic, animalistic fear.
Timur Melik lost absolutely everything material he possessed, but he managed to preserve his dignity and boldly stepped into eternity, entirely unvanquished.
What is the ultimate conclusion of this totally unprecedented clash? According to absolutely every canon of military science and formal logic, Timur Melik suffered a deeply crushing, highly catastrophic fiasco. The brilliant commandant of Khujand violently lost his native city, was completely stripped of his highly unique flotilla and his elite hand-picked garrison, and tragically doomed his very own family to a brutal Mongol captivity. If we measure success solely by cold, dry numbers, we will see him only as a total loser. However, historical memory ultimately judges by vastly different, vastly deeper categories. This brings us to the greatest, most profound paradox of this entire brutal war. The Sultan Muhammad II, who controlled a genuinely boundless treasury, successfully preserved his freedom, but he entirely lost his absolute mind from sheer naked terror. In whispers, the wealthy ruler of half the world died wearing a filthy shirt on a desolate, nameless island, having lost absolutely everything, including the basic respect of all his descendants. Timur Melik, by forcefully surrendering all of his material assets to the advancing enemy, preserved something vastly more valuable, his own unshakable dignity. A deeply cornered lone wolf, fiercely fighting back with a completely blunt arrow out in the scorching desert, proudly stepped into true eternity, utterly unvanquished. This epic episode teaches us a deeply sobering lesson. When entire massive states totally collapse and the elite violently betray their people, the salvation of the nation's honor absolutely does not rest on the shoulders of pampered monarchs. The honor of an entire civilization is ultimately pulled forward by one single, incredibly solitary human being who utterly refuses to bend the knee before the inevitable. Brilliant engineering intellect and a totally unbreakable will of steel are entirely capable of slamming the brakes on the apocalypse itself, proving that the system permanently breaks exactly where the individual actively chooses to resist. Just imagine this truly final, breathtaking image. The wildly churning waters of the Syr Darya proudly carry their waves right across a totally devastated Asia. Drifting aimlessly down the river is a completely empty, heavily battered boat. Its wooden sides are densely pinned with hundreds of heavy Mongol arrows. Inside, there is absolutely not a single soul. But this battered skeleton serves as a towering monument to the one man who managed to show the entire world the completely unthinkable. The sheer, untamed fury of the nomads can absolutely be forced to bleed. The Iron Commandant bravely carried a tiny, deeply fragile torch of pure resistance right through the absolute pitch-black darkness. But eventually, someone else emerged who took that exact same tiny spark and violently fanned it into a massive, raging inferno. A man who was deeply despised by his very own family, but whose sheer, unadulterated courage was greatly admired by the Earthshaker himself. A royal prince violently stripped of his throne. The brilliant military commander who violently dealt the great horde its very first bloody defeat at the Battle of Parwan, permanently causing the massive myth of the invincibility of the demons of the steppe to violently crack. The lone wolf who right on the steep banks of the Indus River will violently throw himself from a 7-meter cliff directly into the churning torrent. This absolutely staggering leap will cause Genghis Khan to instantly halt his archers and loudly declare, "Now that is exactly what a son should be to a father." In the epic final episode of the Wrath of God series, we will dive into the incredible story of the last true hero of the East, Jalal el-Din Mongborni,
an absolute avenger without a state who violently transformed pure despair into the most terrifying, deadly weapon of the century. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you absolutely do not miss the grand finale of this massive tragedy. Leave your comments below. Was Timur Melik's massive gamble genuinely justified? This has been Chronicles of the Greats. Until we meet again.